So what do we use protein for? We use protein to rebuild ourselves. And if you're not replenishing your protein supplies, and perhaps you might be in the over 75, over 80 category, and you're living off toast and biscuits and tea, you're not going to replenish your protein supply, and therefore you're not going to have good muscle tone. This leads to falls. This leads to a few problems. Likewise with diabetes, if you don't have good muscle tone and good energy output, you're more susceptible to diabetes. Osteoporosis, that goes with some of the aging issues, pressure sores and ulcers, which is all about repair. Muscle soreness, if you are exerting energy and you have muscle soreness, you may not be replenishing the amino acids that you've used. So there's hundreds of disease states really that require extra protein, almost all of them. Now, what's interesting about diabetes and certain types of exercise, there used to be a slide in this series of lessons, and it was of a sumo wrestler. And it was never really well explained at the time, but the really interesting thing about sumo wrestlers are they're very big, they're very obese, and they certainly appear they appear to have extra fat. Now, underneath that fat reserve that you see, which is definitely caused by excessive amounts of calorie, underneath the fat supply is a strong muscle tone, and that's what you don't see. So sumo wrestlers eat to excess, they grow very tall and very fatty, but underneath are actually very strong. You can afford to carry extra fat, extra weight, and not get diabetes if you have muscle tone and if you expend energy. Okay, so sumo wrestlers in general don't get diabetes, even though they look as if they should get diabetes because of their diet and being overweight. So that's a really interesting fact. So you'll see with diabetics that if they lose their muscle tone, there's a much bigger risk of exacerbating their diabetes or even getting it in the first place. Now, protein quality. Now, proteins are not all the same. They are categorized into complete or incomplete. Now, just to be very general, meat and dairy food have complete proteins, and that means they have, is a complete protein, are complete proteins, and that means they have all the required amino acids that you need to keep your proteins optimum, to keep your muscle tone, to keep all your tissues working. So dairy and meat have everything you need in terms of amino acids, and that makes them what we call complete proteins. Vegetables and grains and beans, on the other hand, are incomplete, so they don't have all the amino acids that we need. But that's not a problem because we usually mix up our diets. And I think the reason why they've chosen this photo is there's such a variety of foods on selection here that if we eat a little bit of everything, we get all of the amino acids we need day to day. So there's a real trick to eating so that we have all the proteins that we need. There are going to be times, or there were times in history where we couldn't always eat eggs, dairy, and meat. There were times of starvation, there were lean times, there were droughts, there were times where we had to be vegans and vegetarians. And because of these restrictions, we had to eat in a certain way, so we had to combine some foods, and we'll talk about this in a sec. We've also got to factor in how easily we can digest proteins. They're not that easy to digest. When you eat a boiled lolly, the sugar goes straight into your system as glucose, and that's it. Very, very easy process. When you eat a complete protein, for example, you have to be able to break that down It's a little bit more sophisticated than sugar or even fat. Now, protein quality, okay? High quality protein is considered to come from animal foods, meat, fish, poultry, eggs, cheese, and dairy. On the other hand, vegetables, nuts, seeds, grains, and legumes are plant proteins, and they're considered to be complementary. So you've got to get your proteins from one or the other or both, and that's purely choice, probably in our culture, but in other cultures it's a necessity. Now in that picture here, I'm not sure what that is on the right. It looks like a piece of beef, sort of an Asian beef, but there's rice and there's beans. Now there are cultures where the culture has had to fight famine or drought or war. Beans store really well, so do rice. So beans and rice were considered a staple food for a long time. In Central America, where we had black slavery for many centuries, the slaves actually weren't allowed to have meat. They were only given beans and rice. And stories were made up about this, red beans and rice, as the staple food for slavery. Now, you can't work in the fields all day, in the sugarcane fields, and keep your muscle tone without having your proteins being complementary. We've also got beans and rice in a whole lot of other cultures. In China, when there was where there was famine, there were no high quality proteins. It was soybeans and rice. In Africa, in the Middle East. So beans and rice have rescued the day. Of course, in our culture, we can choose to have complementary proteins and combine our amino acids together, or we can choose to have animal foods and have a higher quality protein. Now, there is one exception to the rule. So when we talk about complementary proteins in plant material, we have to usually combine 2 or even 3 foods to get all the amino acids we need. But there is one exception, and I'll give you a bit of a guess as to what is the food in the plant kingdom that has all the amino acids needed. Okay, it's soy. Now, soy gets a bad rap. I'm a big fan of soy though. Soy is amazing. So soybeans themselves are the only exception that we know of in the plant kingdom that has all of the amino acids. So we can almost put it up there with meat, fish, poultry, eggs, cheese, and dairy, which is why traditionally, if you're a vegetarian, we would always encourage you to have soy. Now, because of perhaps the last 20 years of mixed publicity, soy is not eaten anywhere near as much as it used to. So in the 90s, we were all eating tofu, but it isn't so popular now, so I'm happy if we resurrect the tofu idea. Now, this is visually a good graph to show you how you need to eat complementary proteins. So if you take, for example, these 4 amino acids up the top, and then you look at legumes, you can see here with these 4 selected amino acids, legumes have 2 and not the other 2. Grains don't have the first 2 but have the second 2. And together we have all of the proteins. It's as simple as that. Grains do what legumes can't do and vice versa. So we need to do some food combining. Now, you've got to at least do this once a day to maintain your amino acid pool. So when it comes to, say, meal times at night time, make sure if you're a vegetarian you're having legumes and grains together, and just keep that as a stable routine. If you're not a vegetarian, you need to have one of those key high protein foods every day. Now, how are they structured? Proteins are infinitely complex. Okay, so glucose and sugars and all of the different carbohydrates, they're very, very simple. Fatty acids a bit more complex, proteins ridiculously complex. But if we look at the building block of proteins, and let's say it's the brick that we use to build the house, we call that an amino acid. Now, what defines an amino acid? On the left of this red picture, we've got an amino group. On the right, we have an acid group. Okay, and let's just keep them in those positions. The molecule at the top is called the side group, and that is what changes. And underneath the side group, we've got a hydrogen atom. Now, in a lot of structures that we're going to look at, they've actually flipped that down. So the side group is at the bottom, but whatever orientation it is, it always has an amino group and an acid group, and then it changes its side group all the time. It's a little bit like, you know, everybody wearing the same uniform but having a different hat. So the uniform's recognizable, but the hat differentiates every soldier, for example. So has an amino and an acid group, hydrogen atom, and a side group. And that side group determines what it actually does in the body, which is always unique. Now, proteins join their amino acids together like long beads. Now, I know I talked about polysaccharides being long beads of glucose, and indeed they are, and it's just one glucose after another. But with proteins, these amino acid beads, and you could think of it also as pearls, these amino acid beads, they change. So it depends on which amino acid it is. So these long chains have a variety of different patterns. So the example here is they've picked out the tail of this protein strand, and it has a phenylalanine, then a leucine, then a serine, then a cysteine, all lined up together. Now, if we just take phenylalanine, for example, it has the amino group, it has the acid group, and an R group. And R is just the random something on the end of the side group. So protein structure types can be primary, secondary, or quaternary, depending on how complex they are. And they can be a giant, chaotic, seemingly mess of a molecule. They're huge, some of them. So amino acids are the basic structure of proteins. They are categorized as essential and non-essential. Okay, so if the amino acids are essential, they're required in the diet and the body cannot make them. Okay, so if you can't make them, you've got to eat them. And then there's non-essential, which means we can take or leave it. So the non-essential amino acids are not required in the diet, but they can become required. Okay, so that's tricky. Sometimes the non-essential ones can become essential if you've got genetics that don't allow this to happen, or if there's an inadequate intake. So under special conditions, the non-essential ones can become essential. But generally you've got essential and non-essential. Now, the amino acids that are non-essential to human beings can be created or synthesized endogenously, can be created inside our body in a small number of steps. So the non-essential ones are quite easy to create when we need to create them, but the essential ones are actually very complex to create. And that's why we need them, because it's just too hard to make. There's a whole lot of enzymes that are involved in the creation of certain amino acids, certain essential amino acids, and the body just goes, I can't make those ones. I better eat them. So that's That's how our body differentiates. Now here's the category. It's a good idea to print off this slide. On the left, we've got the essential ones: histidine, isoleucine, leucine, lysine, methionine, phenylalanine, threonine, tryptophan, and valine. Some of those you'll already have heard about. You've probably heard about tryptophan. You've probably heard about methionine. On the right, the non-essential amino acids. So these are the ones that we can create because they're simple: alanine, aspartic acid, asparaginine, glutamic acid, serine, and taurine. In the middle, conditionally essential. So these are in brackets here. So we might be able to make them or not make them under certain circumstances. But essentially, just look at the left and the right category. Protein digestion. This is when you've got to start thinking like a clinician now. So protein essentially happens in the stomach, and the leftover of the protein digestion occurs in the small intestine. Okay? If you don't get your stomach right, it's not going to produce protein. So if your client is looking protein deficient, the first thing you've got to do is check out their stomach function, if not their pancreatic capacity. So stomach breakdown of protein depends on stomach acid, hydrochloric acid, and there's some enzymes that get thrown in there in the stomach to facilitate digestion of protein. First thing that happens is the process of denaturation, and then they break down into polypeptides. And then next thing that happens, they get shunted along to the small intestine, and then the small intestine breaks down into smaller peptides and then amino acids, and that's where the pancreas is really important. Note here, protein digestion does not happen in the mouth. Protein digestion does not primarily happen in the small intestine, and it never happens in the large intestine. So let's take a little bit of a tour. So let's start with number 1. The stomach acid cells release gastrin, which enters the blood, causing the release of gastric juices. So you've got to have all your gastric juices before you start. And if you're taking acid blockers, this ain't going to happen. And acid blockers are a big problem with our heartburn population, and that's usually in the over 50 category. Really a big problem in the over 70 category. So whilst the oldies need a lot of protein, a lot of them are not getting the protein because they're suppressing their acid function with medication. So you'll see the oldies with heartburn fading away because they're not getting any protein from their stomach function. So hydrochloric acid in the gastric juice denatures proteins and converts pepsinogen to pepsin, which begins to digest protein. Third thing that happens, partially digested proteins enter the small intestine and cause the release of cholecystokinin. So most of it's in the stomach, and then the small intestine, the beginning of the small intestine, contributes to this process with cholecystokinin. Fourth thing that happens, pancreas is stimulated to release proenzymes of bicarbonate into the intestine. Bicarbonate neutralizes the stomach acid, really important, otherwise you'll get a duodenal ulcer. And the proenzymes are proteases. Now remember, I said in the last lesson that we forget that the pancreas produces digestive enzymes. One of the 3 digestive enzymes is proteases. So we've got lipases for lipids and fats. We have sugar enzymes for sugar, but the proteases are what we need here in this process. Number 5 is probably just what I said here. They are enzymes to digest polypeptides into tripeptides, dipeptides, and free amino acids. So this is when we get a full breakdown of the proteins down into the amino acids. Now that's what we absorb. So we can't absorb big proteins. Okay, so the stomach does the bulk of the hard work here, and by the time we get the proteins down into the small intestine, they should be broken down into their building blocks and ready for absorption. So number 6, intestinal enzymes in the lumen of the small intestine within the mucosal cells complete protein digestion. Stomach starts it, small intestine finishes it. Now that's in a perfect world. Again, medications will change this, stress will change this, hormones will change this. Now, if your small intestine has a lot of inhibiting factors, let's say you've got SIBO, small intestinal bacterial overload, this is very compromised and may not occur properly. If there's not enough small intestinal bacteria, you get that overgrowth. You've got you may have intestinal permeability, or you may have holes in your digestive system to allow big proteins through, and that is what causes food allergies. So my point there is we need complete breakdown of proteins into their building blocks, which are amino acids, and it should only be amino acids that slip through into the blood. If they're not broken down properly and they end up slipping through for whatever reasons, whether there's holes in your intestines or not, and we used to call that leaky gut, no big proteins should be going through. Once you get big proteins getting into the blood, it's a bit of an immune nightmare. So we really want full protein breakdown by the time it gets absorbed. Let's just leave it there.